Hello, class, and welcome to this lesson on institutionalized racism and its relationship to slavery. So, institutionalized racism has been a problem in this country for centuries, and it's something that we're talking about even more here in 2020 with all the different protests and all the different discourse on racism. So, slavery has been a part of the American culture dating all the way back to colonial times. And most people assume that racism began or came with it as soon as slavery started. But that isn't totally true, and there's a reason for that. So, slavery and racism has not been linked throughout most of human history. In fact, most places that had slaves, the slaves were the same race as the slavers. They may have been from a different country or a different civilization, like Romans taking, Egyptians or Greeks as slaves. But you also had Romans taking other Romans as slaves. Even in the colonies, you had some people who were slaves because they couldn't pay their debts. So, what are some places that where slavery was not tied to race that you guys can think of, other than the few times, or other than the few examples that I gave you? So, if slavery is not always linked to racism, how did it become like that in America? Edmund Morgan looks at that in his book, American Slavery, American Freedom. So, in early Virginia, where the book really focuses on, the most of the work was done by indentured servants. So, indentured servants are people who would come over from England and they would work in the New World as basically slaves. They were technically servants, but they did the same work that you would imagine a slave doing. The difference was they were going to be white, and they would only be a servant for a certain length of time. It was usually either 4 to 7 years. And the idea here was somebody who had money, who was a planter in the New World, would pay for your boat trip over to the New World, and then you would pay off that debt by working for them for a certain amount of years. After your term was up, the person who sponsored you would give you, a gun, some supplies, and some tracts of land. Now, this worked really well in the beginning because there was a ton of land that was unclaimed or unclaimed for the colonials. Of course, Native Americans were living on that land, but the colonial people didn't really care about that. And a lot of people also died before they fulfilled their uh, term. So what ended up happening is this was a really good deal for the planters because you could just keep bringing people over. They would work for you for just the price of you bringing them over here, and then you wouldn't have to give them any land. You wouldn't have to supply them with any supplies, and you could just keep getting more and more servants. But starting around 1650 and the late 1600s, a lot of these indentured servants started living longer, and they started living to the end of their tenure. So what ended up happening was you had a lot of these poor white people who were free of their service and going out and looking for land. But the more people who are out there looking for land, the less land there is, which meant that people had to go out into more Native American controlled territory, and they had to try to get land that wasn't as fertile, and they just weren't able to sustain themselves. So they started to kind of crowd around cities looking for work, looking for anything to sustain themselves and their families. During this time, slaves took over more of the work from the indentured servants because indentured servants were living longer. So if you just bought a slave, you didn't have to free them and then give them supplies and give them land and everything after they were done. So you started to have this switch from indentured servitude to slavery starting in the late 1600s. And one of the big fears that came about once Virginia moved to a slave based economy was the fear of an uprising. There's no matter where you have slaves, there's always a fear of a slave revolt. And the planters were really afraid because you had all of these poor whites who were usually well armed because in colonial America you had to be to survive, who were disenfranchised. They were down on their luck. They didn't have much money, and they were pretty tied to the slaves who were in the same position, basically. Of course, servants had a lot more freedom. They weren't slaves. They weren't actually servants anymore, so they could go and do whatever, but they really didn't have a lot of options. So planters were terrified that there was going to be a joint uprising between these poor whites and the slaves. So planters were afraid of this joint uprising because servants and slaves were known to work together, escape together, and help each other out. They were even seen and treated somewhat equally. There was still some racism in the system, but it wasn't as dramatic as it would be in the following centuries, and it wasn't institutionalized yet. There's even records of slaves having to give consent for their own sale to another master, which is something you would never see in the 17 and 1800s. So put yourself in the shoes of the planter class. How would you deal with this problem of poor whites and slaves working together and potentially getting together to overthrow you? So what they did was they started passing racist laws, because if they could separate the poor whites and the slaves and make the poor whites believe that they're more closely tied to the rich whites than they are to the slave Africans, there wouldn't be as much of an incentive to unite together in a slave uprising. So you started seeing a bunch of different laws being passed that just weren't on the books prior to the late 1600s. Things like a servant who ran away with a slave would have to pay for the total cost of the slave to the master if he got caught. Um, Laws that said killing slaves was not illegal because it was decided that nobody would actually want to kill their own property or destroy their own property, so you couldn't have murderous intent towards a slave. Slaves couldn't be baptized, which was a really big thing back then because that meant they couldn't be Christians. So you have these Christian poor whites versus these heathen Africans, and it made this religious divide between the two, which really affected the psychology of the people at the time, a lot more than it would even today. Another law was slave property was given to poor whites because there were different masters in the early parts of slavery who would actually give different a cow or a plot of land, stuff like that, to their favorite slave to kind of help them sustain themselves. It was made illegal to give slaves land, and slaves couldn't own land. And if any slave did own land, it was given to the church to be given to the poor whites. So this created this idea that the poor whites are better and they're the only ones who deserve land, slaves don't. And so poor whites really started to see themselves above the slaves. And this is where you get this institutionalized racism, where these laws that are designed to separate poor whites and slaves create this idea that even if you're poor, even if you are in the same socioeconomic status as a slave, the fact that you're white makes you better. And this is a institutional kind of cultural idea that has been with us to this day. It's lessened over time, but it's still present.